Rick was here last year. This is his second year with us, so I'd like you to give him a warm welcome. Thank you, Rick.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I promise to be marginally more interesting than a packet, so I hope you'll stick with me here. My name is Rick Jakious. I am District Director for Congressman Seth Moulton. He is your U.S. representative. How many, quick show of hands, how many of you are familiar or have ever heard of Seth? Okay, very good. Yes, Congressman Moulton. He prefers I call him Seth. He prefers most people call him Seth, so I'll call him Seth through this presentation. I'm going to tell you a little bit about Seth, what inspired him to run for office, run for Congress, what we do as an office, and what the role is of a congressional office, both here in Massachusetts as well as D.C. And then I want to make sure we just have a conversation that you want to have. So we'll open it up to some questions and comments, and we'll just kind of take it from there. So Seth is 38 years old. That may sound kind of old to you all, but by congressional terms, that's actually quite young. He was born and raised in Marblehead, Massachusetts, and did his undergraduate studies at Harvard. And he studied physics at Harvard. He likes to say that it makes him sound really smart for anyone who has seen his resume and didn't see his transcripts. And while he was at Harvard, he developed a real respect for the young men and women who had stepped up and served their country in the U.S. military. He attended a church in Harvard, Harvard Memorial Church. And in that church is a memorial to the young men, at that point all men, who had been from Harvard and who had served and died in World War I and World War II. And that really caused him to reflect as he was graduating on kind of his role and what he should be doing. And he had so much respect for the young men and women who had stepped up to serve their country that he decided to join the U.S. Marine Corps. So he volunteered to be an officer in the Marines. And this was just several months before September 11th. So he had no idea that our entire world, our country, our world was about to change, that we were about to enter into an extended war in Iraq and Afghanistan, one that he eventually came to disagree with, but still went and served 4 combat tours in Iraq as part of that war. And so he was involved in combat. He won the Bronze Star. In fact, when he returned and he ran for Congress, there was an investigative journalist, a guy who worked for the Boston Globe Spotlight team. He's the kind of reporter, if you get a call from him, you're a little worried. You're like, uh-oh, why is this guy calling me? Well, this reporter thought, well, Seth, this guy seems too good to be true. He can't be this, young war hero running for Congress. We're going to dig in and we're going to figure out a little bit more about his background. And so he started digging into Seth's background, and it came out that Seth had won the Bronze Star and a couple of other awards for his valor and some of the stuff he had done in service, and he had never bothered to tell anybody. He was running for Congress, and he wasn't out there talking about the medals and the awards he had received, because he really felt strongly that for the people who had been through that, they didn't like to talk about that sort of thing. They didn't like to kind of wear that on their sleeves. Their service, there were a lot of young men and women they served with who didn't get to come home. And so they felt to respect those individuals. They didn't talk about that aspect of his service. But Seth did 4 combat tours in Iraq. At one point, his job was actually to help rebuild the civil infrastructure in Baghdad. So after the government was deposed, they had to rebuild everything. They had to rebuild the electric infrastructure. The country had never had a free press. And so he was assigned to a team whose job was to actually help the Iraqis understand how to create its own free press. And so they didn't know how to do that. These were young Marines. And so they started by playing movies. They had DVDs that they had brought from America. They decided they didn't have any content. They didn't have any programming. There was no such thing as Netflix at the time. So they just started running these DVDs, and they were playing them in Baghdad. But they realized that American movies sometimes were a little inappropriate by Iraqi standards. There was bad language, there were inappropriate love scenes, there were things that were not okay by Iraqi standards. And so when they got to those parts of the movies, they had to hit fast forward really quick and skip over them. And so it's someone's job to play these movies, but to skip over all the stuff that they thought would be inappropriate. So one day Seth was leaving with his interpreter, another young man by the name of Muhammad. And they were stopped by a group of young Iraqi police officers who were visibly angry. And Seth was like, oh gosh, did we offend them? I'm not sure what happened here. Like, Muhammad, can you ask them what's wrong? And so Muhammad talks to these young men, and they turns and looks at Seth and says, they're upset because every time you get to the good parts in the movie, you always fast forward over them. So they quickly realized they had to come up with a plan B. They needed some more original programming, and so Seth actually had his own television program with his interpreter, Muhammad, and it was called Molten and Muhammad. And it was a current affairs TV show, and they talked about what was happening in Baghdad, and they talked about what was happening in Iraq, and it was basically a talk show. And Seth likes to joke that he was actually far more famous. You get far more people asked for his autograph when he was in Baghdad than they do now as a member of Congress. And so when Seth returned, he went back to school. He went to the Harvard Kennedy School, Harvard Business School, got graduate degrees, and then went off to Texas to work on a high-speed rail project. But he realized while he was down there that it really didn't have he didn't have the same sense of purpose. The work he was doing didn't have the same sense of meaning and purpose that his service in the Marine Corps had. And so he was working on a project that he was passionate about, but also not feeling like he had this same sense of purpose in his life. And that's when a mutual friend of ours, a woman by the name of Emily Cherniak, started a nonprofit organization whose job it was to get military, Peace Corps, and AmeriCorps members to run for elected office. The whole idea was that we had never had fewer veterans serving our country than we do now. There was a time when 70–80% of the U.S. Congress had all served together in World War II or the Vietnam War, and the idea was that if you had served your country, if you'd put on the uniform, if you had served your country, that you understood how to do things for the betterment of your country, how to set aside partisan differences and do what was right for the country. And so the idea was that this nonprofit was going to recruit people like Seth who had served in the military or the Peace Corps or AmeriCorps to come back to run for office. And for the first time, Seth felt that kind of idea, that sense of purpose that he had felt during his time in the Marine Corps. So he came back home, moved to Salem, decided to run for office against a 18-year incumbent. He ran against a member of his own party. He was the only person in the country that year to defeat a member of their own party in a primary. And then he went on to win the general election and has been your congressman for the last 4 years. As your member of Congress, it's his job to represent you all, not to represent who voted for him, not to represent Republicans or Democrats, not to represent people who are of voting age versus people who are not yet of voting age, to represent everyone. There's about 750,000 people in this congressional district, 39 cities and towns. It's most of Essex County and a little bit of Middlesex County. It's basically the entire northeastern corner of Massachusetts. He's one of 9 members of Congress in Massachusetts, and as you, I'm sure, all know, 435 members of the House of Representatives across the entire country. And it's his job to go to D.C. and represent our interests and vote on the laws that we feel are important to be passed. Now, as you can all imagine, it doesn't always work that way. There are times that Congress doesn't do what we want it to do, and increasingly there are definitely kind of challenges with what Congress is getting done, and we'll discuss that more a little later. But I want to tell you first about kind of the work that we do. What is Seth's job? So in D.C. he's working on policy. He's working on laws and policies that affect the lives of Americans and people in this district. And I have a team here. I, as his district director, am kind of Seth's eyes and ears here in Massachusetts when he can't be here, when he's down in D.C. I interact with students. I interact with elected leaders, business leaders, to try and understand what people need. What are their interests? How is the work that's being done in D.C. affect them? And how can we learn from what's happening here to change laws and policies at the federal level? And we also work to help constituents like yourselves. So people who may be having trouble with the IRS or Social Security or the VA. We've helped people with terminal illness get onto Medicare so that their illness doesn't bankrupt themselves and their family and they can get the medical care they need. We've helped elderly veterans get medals that they had earned but never received. So it's really our job to kind of help support the needs and interests of our constituents. And so I want to talk a little bit about what Congress does, but I first want to pause there and just get a sense of, based on kind of Seth, his background, what it is we do, what questions do you have? What do you want to know? I'm here, you've met with members of your municipal government, state government. I'm here to represent, obviously, the federal government. So no questions out of bounds, fire away.
So, when you said that he went to Texas to work on a high-speed thing, did you mean infinity loop?
Is that kind of like the Hyperloop?
Yeah.
No, he was working on a more conventional high-speed rail project that would connect, I believe, Dallas and Houston. It ended up, there was money set aside as part of what it was called ARA, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, that was supposed to be invested in high-speed rail infrastructure. That project never actually happened, but it was just a conventional high-speed rail project. High-speed rail and rail transit is a big sort of passion of Seth's, something he's cared about his whole life, something he thinks we need to invest in. You see countries all around the world that are investing in high-speed rail, that are investing in sort of subway-like frequency across all of their rail systems. He thinks, all of you have probably sat with your family in traffic going in and out of Boston. He thinks if we're ever going to address that and we're going to grow this region, we have to invest in rail. So it's a big emphasis of his. What else? Other questions? About Congress, about Seth, about the work we do? Yes?
How long did he stay in Marine?
How long was he a Marine? He was a Marine. I don't want to get that number wrong. I want to say it was 6 years, give or take, but I don't recall exactly. He did four tours of duty, and I did not serve in the military myself, so I'm not sure what that equates to timeline-wise. Yeah.
Where is the bronze star he has? Where did he put it, I guess, in his house?
I assume he has it somewhere in his house. I haven't actually seen it. That's a great question. The question was, where is his bronze star? He's got a really interesting collection of a lot of photographs and other things he collected during his time in Iraq in his house, and so I suspect there's somewhere in his home office or somewhere where he keeps a lot of those mementos and reminders from his time in Iraq. What else? It's a good question. I've never been asked that one before. Any questions about any legislative topics? Anyone? Yeah.
What exactly is Seth doing today? Isn't he voting on something?
Say that again?
What is Seth doing today? Isn't he voting on a bill or something?
Oh, what is he doing today? Yeah, he's in Washington, D.C. today. So typical schedule for a member of Congress is he is in D.C. typically Tuesday through Thursday, and then either Monday or Friday. And then most members of Congress will come home to their home districts afterwards. So they'll be home, either Friday, Saturday, Sunday, or Saturday, Sunday, Monday, and do events and things here in their district. So today, when he's in DC, our team starts every single morning with a video conference call. We see each other, we talk about what's going on in the world, we talk about what is going on in DC and Congress, we talk about what's happening here in the district, we get our plans and priorities for the day, and then Seth goes off to any number of committee meetings where they discuss, he's on the House Armed Services and the Budget Committee. They may be talking about, if he says armed services, they may be talking about defense programs or military operations. If it's the Budget Committee, they have conversations about how the federal government is allocating its money. So he'll have committee hearings, he'll have constituent meetings, groups will come down to DC and meet, they'll visit his office, they'll either meet with a staffer or himself. And then there's quite honestly a whole heck of a lot of fundraising that goes into being a member of Congress. That's one of the things that's broken about Congress is the amount of money that is necessary to compete and win in a congressional race. How many years or how frequently do we have elections for a congressman? Does anyone know the answer to that? Yeah.
Is it 2 years?
It's 2 years. So it's every other year, every even year, the entire House of Representatives is up for re-election. Now, does anyone know why that is? There's actually a very good reason for why that is, although money complicates it. We'll talk about that in a second. Why on earth do we elect our congressman every 2 years? It seems like a lot to me. Anyone know? Anyone want to venture a guess? Why do we elect congressmen so frequently, every 2 years? Why not 4 or 6 years? What's the advantage to having a shorter timeline? Yeah. More gets done because they don't have longer of a term. You're on the right track, although I don't think the answer is quite right. It's not that more gets done, it is, yeah. They get new perspectives? By getting new people in? Okay, that's one possible answer. It sort of refreshes, it brings new people into the Congress. You get new perspectives. That's also kind of part, you guys are honing in on the answer, but you're not quite there yet. Yeah?
Every 2 years, because there's of Republicans and Democrats might shift. And if, let's say, the president's Republican, there's more Democrats in the next 2 years, and it becomes more Republican.
Yeah, I think you're onto it. I think we've sort of triangulated there with the three answers. And he was talking about something about the sort of dynamic and the balance between Republicans and Democrats. It's every 2 years. 435 members of the House are voted on every 2 years because this is in the word, U.S. House of Representatives. It's their job to represent the needs and interests of their communities. We talked about that early on. Think about the difference between the House and the Senate. There's 435 members of the House. How many members of the Senate are there? Yeah? What's that? 100. House is voted every 2 years. Senate is voted every how many years? Yeah? Every 6 years. So the idea is that the House, so that means the House turns over. 100% of the members of the House could be voted in or out every 2 years. Whereas the Senate, since it's every 6 years, you're only voting on a third of the Senate every 2 years. So the Senate's going to be much more stable. And there's much fewer people. The House is meant to be very responsive to the needs and interests. So if people get upset about what's happening in their country, then they have an opportunity every 2 years to change that by voting in or out their member of the House of Representatives. So that's ultimately why it's every 2 years for the House of Representatives. Yeah, question?
Has he met the president?
Has he met the president? I don't think he's met President Trump. He met President Obama a couple times. I don't believe he has yet met President Trump. What else? Yeah. How long have we worked together? So I've worked for Seth almost the entire time that he has been elected. I came into his office about 4 months after he was elected. The same woman who recruited him to run for office is an old friend of mine, knew I had background in politics and service as well, and recruited me to come work for him. So I've worked for him for about 3.5 years. Other questions? Yeah.
Have you met President Trump?
Have I met President Trump? I haven't. I've met the 5 presidents before him, but I have not yet met President Trump.
Would you like to meet him?
Would I like to meet him? Sure, absolutely. I met Obama, yes. We stood in line at the airport together once.
When he was president?
No, when he was senator.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. Okay. What else? What are some issues you guys have been talking about? Let's dig in on some of the federal issues and talk about the ways in which it's Seth's job to think about those issues and help pass legislation. What's a topic of conversation that is important to you all that you've been talking about?
So we've been talking a little bit about the Bill of Rights and the freedoms applied to teenagers. So we were talking about like freedom of the press and social media and people going after you for social media. So does Congressman Moulton have a platform on social media, or does he ever talk about certain things in social media, either at teens or in his jobs, that Because I know he's on social media all the time.
Yeah. It's a great question. So Seth is one of the few members of Congress who actually personally does all of his own tweets. So when you're reading a tweet from Seth, it's coming from him. And that's a great way for him to be directly engaged and involved with his constituents and to speak with others. It's frequent that in the media his tweet will be quoted because folks know that's not coming from his communications team, that's coming directly from him. So it's one of the big areas of importance for us is transparency as government. We believe it's our job to be very transparent about the work we're doing and communicating that to people. And technology is a great way to communicate the work we're doing. So we use Twitter, we use Facebook. Our Instagram and Snapchat game is weak, I'll admit. We need some young people like you to come intern in our office and help us up our game there. We have tried to do some sort of fun and inventive stuff. When Pokemon Go was still kind of a hot thing, we did some voter registration drives where we bought some Pokemon and drew people to our voter registration drives using Pokemon Go. So we've tried to be very progressive about the way we use technology and computers and social media to communicate and have a conversation with our constituents. In terms of legal, or in terms of laws and policy, there hasn't been a lot that's come across across Seth's desk on this. Obviously, net neutrality has been a big issue.
Brought that up to me, actually.
Yeah.
He brought that up to me this year.
Yeah. So who knows a little about net neutrality? Tell me what you think about net neutrality. Yep, go ahead.
So net neutrality is a law that was enacted 2 years ago by the Obama administration, which makes it illegal for companies to slow down specific websites that they're competing with.
Yeah.
And, I just think it should stay where it is because multiple companies have shown interest in breaking all the laws that would violate net neutrality. They've already broken the rules of this.
Yeah. Yes. So net neutrality, as he said, is the efforts to roll back net neutrality are basically to allow companies to be able to throttle or treat different people's data differently. And so a company that provides your internet service could slow down or charge more for certain other companies that use lots of bandwidth in order to provide their service on their platform. So your Comcast or your Verizon could charge more or box people out, and it does not allow for kind of the free and open sharing of information across the internet, which is fundamentally sort of how the internet has become as pervasive and important as it is. It has a huge impact on our economy because you look at a lot of the businesses that are being started. Small businesses are tech-oriented. They use a lot of bandwidth in the internet and the access to be able to use that and to have access to get your product to the market without having a kind of firewall put in place by these other companies is incredibly important. What else?
We have time for maybe one more question.
One more question. Okay, hit me with both of them and I'll try to answer them both at the same time.
One and one.
So, why did you choose to run for the House of Representatives instead of the Senate?
Okay, and what's the other question?
Net neutrality, the attack against net neutrality be considered an attack on free speech because the companies are trying to subdue the speech of certain companies and other websites?
Okay, that's a great question. Is the efforts to limit net neutrality an attack on free speech? I think I'm to use a quote that's been used a lot in the last few days. I'm not a constitutional lawyer or a constitutional scholar. So I don't know that it would be considered an attack on free speech because it is a service that's being provided, but there is an argument that is being made that it should be treated akin to a utility, right? So, like your water service or your electrical service, that if you're being provided water or electricity, you should have sort of equal and fair access to that, and that the internet should be treated in the same way. To the first question about Seth and running for for the House versus running for the, you say it's House versus Senate, or just why did he choose the House?
Why did you choose the House?
Yeah. Well, Seth didn't have a background in politics, and so the barrier to entry to get in at any level of politics is actually quite high. I mean, it's abnormal, I guess, to see people coming in from outside politics and kind of running and competing. What we're seeing right now, frankly, kind of since the election of Trump and with the Me Too movement and a lot of people getting really excited about politics is kind of new and unique. I mean, typically what you saw was people might run for state office or a local city council or town council, and they'd work their way up and, you know, through elections, and when someone retires or gets a new job, it'd be almost kind of musical chairs. People would then, you know, just run for office and kind of work their way up through the ranks. I think Seth believes that we want a diversity of ideas and opinions. We want people to come from outside government. We want people to come from the private sector, come from the military, come from sort of state office, bring a diversity of perspectives. And so I think he felt like the House of Representatives was a point of entry that was the right point of entry for him. He wanted to make an impact on a national scale, have conversations about federal issues, the things he cared about were issues of national importance, and you know, there was sort of this opportunity to come and run in his own backyard.
Great.
Great.
So,
Well, thank you all very much.
give Rick a round of applause.